Hello everybody, this is Kenneth Chair from the University of Iowa. I hope that you're all doing well during this obviously a very challenging time for all of us. But I'm so glad that IBA still decided to host their annual conference online. And I would like to thank Chris Strohmeyer, the president of IBA, for the kind invitation to give a talk on saxophone basics. But before we do that, I would like to share a performance of a piece by Swedish composer Lars-Erik Larsson. It was recently found in a library somewhere in France, and the title is called Waltz. I hope you will enjoy this performance as well as this portion of the conference. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed listening to Lars Erik Larsson's Waltz. That is one of those rare original compositions that was written for the saxophone by an important composer. And that is a piece that your students can play. We'll talk more about saxophone literature a little later on. For now, today I would like to start speaking on sound concept. I think we would all agree how important it is for students to have a good sound concept in order to learn an instrument. Any instrument really, but particularly the wind instruments. And that is because for wind instrument, the students has to manipulate so many things physically in order to produce a sound on the instrument. So a good tone concept would help them to emulate. But most people don't realize is that a good sound concept or a bad one can last a lifetime. So you see how important it is for us to give the best examples to the students. I still remember in my own study early on in middle school back in Hong Kong, I had no saxophone teacher because there were none around at that time. My first teacher was a bassoonist who was also the band director. He was a wonderful teacher and he helped me a lot. He did his best. But in terms of sound concept, I had to find other resources to help myself to gain that knowledge. I was indeed shocked to find two classical saxophone records in the library there. One of the recordings was by my former saxophone teacher, Dr. Eugene Rousseau. I still remember vividly the golden tone, the warm sound, and the singing quality that he was able to produce in the recording. And so that really imprinted on my mind what an ideal saxophone sound should be like. And so it helped me really in my own practicing as I was trying to copy what his sound was like. And for your students, especially the more sensitive, more students who are more in tune with the body, how to manipulate the bodies, they will be able to adjust their airspeed, manipulate the embouchure, the oral cavity, tongue position, so on and so forth, just by relying on the concept that they hear in their mind. And so here are some things that you can do to help them. Obviously, you can find them saxophone recordings. Nowadays there are many out there, especially classical saxophone recordings. And I have listed some of them on my handout. If you're able to find professional recitals that you can ask your student to go to, that would be ideal. Even the university or college level saxophonists, today they're playing at a very, very high level. So I would also encourage them to go to university student recitals. It is very important for them to learn sound concept that way, as well as what the students are studying, what repertoire they are studying at a university level. And I think most importantly is for you to be able to find them a saxophone teacher. I know it's not possible always, but that is really the quickest and the easiest way to be accountable to what they're doing on the instrument, because they will get constant feedback and examples from the teacher, and that would really, really help them in their future learning. So those are some of the ideas that I have on sound concept. One of the most important things to remember about saxophone embouchure is that it is not the same as a clarinet embouchure. They're completely different. A saxophone embouchure is much rounder with an O shape, while a clarinet embouchure is more like a smirk, with everything pulled back, a chin flat. And it is also important to remember that however you shape your lips will also affect the shape of your oral cavity. As a result, it will also affect the sound that the student will produce inside the horn. And when I'm talking about embouchure, often I remind people that I'm not just talking about the lips area. There are actually 4 areas that are very important in the mechanism of playing the saxophone. The lips, the tongue muscle, the opening of your throat, and the upper palates. Now, how all these areas interact with each other and how they interact with the airstream may be a little bit beyond the scope of this video. But nonetheless, I just want to point out that an embouchure is important because it affects all these areas while you play the saxophone. So it's very important that the students be able to have a stable and correct shape embouchure. Now often when I teach embouchure, especially when a student has a difficult time feeling what it should feel like to have the right embouchure, I would suggest using a tool like a chapstick, or sometimes they can even find a tube of cork grease that they have in their case. And what they do is simply just wrap their lips around the chapstick like this. And then just hold it straight out. It is important to remember to keep the chapstick straight, not dripping like that, or going out like that, but keep it straight. Now, while with the saxophone embouchure, obviously with a saxophone mouthpiece, you would need to put the top teeth on top of the mouthpiece and the lower lip wrapped on top of the lower teeth. So it's slightly different, but the shape or the feeling, at least the feeling of the shape, is exactly the same. So when the student are playing on the mouthpiece, the chapstick shape would help them to imagine what it should feel like. Another thing to remember is that you notice when I'm forming the embouchure around the mouthpiece, I'm trying not to engage the surrounding muscle. So in other words, the surrounding muscle must at least look relatively relaxed, not very tense or pull back at all. So even when I'm playing on the mouthpiece, hopefully you see that my face didn't really get too tight or bunch up at all. So the facial muscle is relatively relaxed. So the only place that you're controlling the mouthpiece and the reed are really this round area right there. So this is the control area for your embouchure. Choosing and buying a saxophone mouthpiece or reed or other accessories can be a very daunting task because there are just too many options out there. Even for the most advanced players, it can become a very complicated and frustrating procedure. So if you are able to offer your students a few options to start with, it will make their life a lot easier. So I'd like to start with mouthpieces. Instead of giving you all the brand names here, I have listed my recommendations on my handout, so please refer to my notes. There are 3 points I would like to share with you that I hope would be helpful to you and your students in choosing the right mouthpiece. First of all, try to stick with brand name mouthpieces. And the reasons are quite simple. First of all, almost all of the brand name mouthpieces have been tested for many years by professionals in the field. So you know that they are well made and well designed. Secondly, they are much more readily available in many music shops, so you don't have to search online or some other places to try to find the mouthpiece that you need, and that is really a big plus. Thirdly, the companies that make those branding mouthpieces spend a lot of time and money to make sure that they have the highest quality control, and that is very important because you want a product that is consistent from one to the other. So those are the three reasons why you should stick with the brand name. Secondly, there are also many sizes of mouthpieces. So my suggestion is, instead of trying to study or learn what all these different sizes mean, try to start with the medium, and then you can go from there. If it's too big, then you can go down in the size, and I'll explain a little bit more in a minute here. But start with the medium would be a good place to start with. And the third point is, when you ask the student to choose the mouthpiece, it would be best if you can ask them to go to a music shop and try several mouthpieces. Yes, even though these branding mouthpieces have good quality control, and they should be very close to each other in terms of the quality, but they do have a little bit difference in terms of the feel of playing or some intonation and control issues. So it is best if you are able to help the student to choose the mouthpiece from many options. Often that's not possible, especially if you're from a smaller towns that you don't have access to a big music shop that carry a lot of mouthpieces. There are some options online companies that would offer you an opportunity to try several mouthpieces, and then you would just keep the one that you choose. So that is certainly an option for your students. So when we're looking for mouthpiece, there are two things that are very important. The first thing is intonation. The second thing is ease of playing or control. So obviously those are you're only able to test it if you're able to play the instrument well. So and that's why it's important to have a teacher, a saxophone teacher for your students, so that the teacher may try to test the mouthpiece for them. But otherwise, again, just by sticking with the branding mouthpieces, usually they have a good intonation and good control to start with, so you don't have to worry too much about that. In terms of materials of the mouthpieces, obviously there are basically two types. One is hard rubber. Another type is metal mouthpieces, which are usually for jazz playing. For the purpose of this talk, I'm just going to stick with the hard rubber. And even for the jazz players, I would still recommend starting with a hard rubber mouthpiece instead of a metal mouthpiece, because a good designed hard rubber mouthpiece can achieve pretty much the same sound quality that most jazz players are seeking. So when the players have advanced to a certain level, if they want to try a mouthpiece made with different materials, they certainly can do that. But in the beginning, I would recommend sticking with the hard rubber. So I just want to briefly, I know most of you probably are not saxophonists, but I do want to just give you a few labels on the mouthpiece, so that you kind of know what people are talking about when you go to the music store. So the most common labels that you have to try to remember is the tip opening, and then the facing, the chamber, and then the baffle of the mouthpiece. Now, by tip opening, I am referring to the space between the reed and the tip rail of the mouthpiece. So often there are large opening, medium, or small, basically. And most general playing or classical playing mouthpieces, they have a small to medium opening. And the bigger the opening, the more power it will give out. Now, another, the label facing, when we're talking about the facing, is the gap between the tip of the opening to the point where the reed is touching the mouthpiece. So when you have a long facing, it gives the sound would be a much more mellower and darker. But when you have a shorter facing, usually means that it will have a bigger tip as well. So those are usually found on the jazz mouthpieces. So for classical playing or concert band playing, you want to stick with, again, everything medium. So medium tip opening, medium facing, if you can. And because there are so many different numbers and destination depending on the brand that you choose, so I can't really, it's very difficult for me to tell you all the details here. But I have listed some explanation on my notes as well. So hopefully that will be helpful to you. So again, let me just recap quickly. Try to stick with the brand name mouthpieces, and try to start with medium size. And then lastly, when possible, have your student try several mouthpieces before they choose the one that they like. So many aspects of choosing saxophone reeds are similar to that of saxophone mouthpiece. For example, try to stick with brand name items. So with reed, you also try to stick with brand name reeds. Again, I have put my recommendation on my handouts. Because brand name reeds have just a better quality control and better design, better cut in general, so you know that you have a good quality reed for your students. Unfortunately, unlike even 10 years ago, most of us reed players only deal with reeds that are made with cane. But nowadays, the technology has advanced so much that a lot of companies have started making the synthetic reed. And the question is always asked whether I should try the synthetic reed or should I just completely switch to using synthetic reed. Personally, I like the quality that the synthetic reeds are giving out today, but they, to me, they are still nowhere near the sound quality and the feeling when we play of the cane reed. And again, that's my personal opinion. And so personally, I deal, most of the time, I deal with the cane reeds. But for students, these two options can be tested, and they should, and see which one would be good for them. Now, when it comes to mouthpieces or reed, a lot of times the things that are important is the size, which size to choose. Remember, with mouthpieces, try to stick with medium and go from there. With reeds, I would also recommend sticking with the medium or a little bit softer reed, because for most beginners, their embouchure is not as strong. So if you give them too thick of a reed, they might have a hard time producing a sound. So a softer reed would help them. And then usually as they grow as a player, they will be able to withstand the pressure that the thicker reed is giving out, so they would be able to control it easier. Unfortunately, many companies have their own label or destination of sizes. So some companies would use numbers. Some companies would use words like soft, medium, or hard. So as you can tell, that it gets complicated. but fortunately most of the brand names reeds, they use numbers. So for example, number 2 would equal pretty much soft, and then 3 would be medium, 3.5 also kind of medium, but 4 and 5 would be the hard reed. So my suggestion is start your students on the medium to medium soft, and then if it doesn't work, then they can either move down or move up in the numbers. So yes, with brand name reeds, the prices are going to be a little more expensive, but I would not save the money and try to get cheaper reeds, because the quality are just not the same, and it will definitely affect how they sound. So another item that is necessary to complete what is referred to as the sound resonator for a saxophone is a ligature for the mouthpiece. So the main purpose of a saxophone ligature is to hold the reed onto the mouthpiece and secure it, and that's it. So knowing the purpose, even the ligature that normally comes with the saxophone that the student buy is good enough as a starter, especially for most beginners. As the player's maturity grows and as their tonal identity develop, and the awareness of what they are looking for, then they can go out and try different designs and different brands of ligatures to choose the one that gives them the best feeling and the sound that they really desire. But basically, for saxophone ligature, there are 2 types of design. So one is a ligature with screws that are on the bottom, and then another one like this one is what's called an inverted ligature. So the question is often asked is, so which one is better? To be honest, the differences are really very minute. Mostly it's just it might be only can be felt by the player or can be heard by the player. To the outside audience, it might not make that much of a difference. But personally, I like the inverted version of the ligature, and again, that can be a very personal choice. Another the design difference is there are ligatures with 2 screws, and there are ligatures that are with only 1 screw. And again, the question is often asked, so which ones should we get and why the difference? Now personally, I believe, just from my experience and testing for many years, that the 2 screws version gives a better hug to the reed, so to speak, and it gives a better feeling for my lip, and the resonance that it can create, for me it's richer than ligatures that with only 1 screw. Now often the reason for the redesigning from 2 screw to 1 screw is not so complicated or so sophisticated. One time I talked to a famous designer of ligature, and I asked the reason why their company decided to change from 2 screw to 1 screw, and they just said, well, because it's easier. So as you can see, it's not very sophisticated. It's just because it's easier to screw 1 screw than 2 screws, and of course I agree. However, any little changes that they make to the ligature, such as number of screws, where the screws are, the thickness of the material, and the materials they use, obviously would affect the vibration of the reed itself. But again, some of these results can only be felt by the player themselves, and a lot of times outside in the concert hall, people might not be able to distinguish that kind of differences. Suffice to say that ligature is really a personal choice. So again, when you have younger students, they can just start with a simple ligature. As long as it holds the reed tightly and it's not leaking air, that's a good sign. Now, speaking of leaking air from the mouthpiece, one thing that I often tell people to do is, once they secure the reed on the mouthpiece, one test that they can do is to put the mouthpiece on their palm and try to seal the bottom of the mouthpiece, and then they will suck the air from the mouthpiece, and you can hear the pop sound, right? So if you hear a delayed pop sound, it means that the mouthpiece is sealed. So the ligature is sealing the reed onto the mouthpiece securely. So that is a good sign. Now sometimes if you do the same thing and if the reed is not secure, it will not make a suction. It will not make a pop sound because air is leaking out from the side. So that is one test that you can, and it's a fun test for the students to do as well. Okay, so I hope that these ideas give you some pointers to help your students with the mouthpiece, reed, and the ligature selection. So one aspect of saxophone playing that is often considered very difficult to teach and very difficult to master as well, and that is tonguing and learning the tongue positions when you play. And part of the reason for that is the player can't really see inside their mouth. All they can do is to feel what their tongue is doing, and often that is a very difficult task, especially for younger players. So I have a few suggestions and tips, so hopefully that you can keep those in mind and make sure that the students don't do some of these things, and that might just help them to approach the tonguing aspect of saxophone playing a little bit easier. So number one, the back of the tongue position, the back of the tongue cannot be dropped. The level of the back of the tongue should be slightly raised or just at a normal position, just like you are sitting or you're standing right now, like I'm not doing anything. My tongue would be kind of slightly in a rested position. Often, especially when students learn how to play jazz music, people would tell them to open their throat or drop the back. And that's, while it might help them to play louder, it's actually detrimental to their control. Because when the back of the tongue is open, their control of dynamics, control of tonguing, control of intonation, all those would be lost. Be extremely difficult. They will have to do some maneuvering with their lips or other parts of the face to try to do that. So it really creates a lot of other issues. So one thing, if there was one thing that you should remember, is to make sure the tongue is in a normal rested position and not pulled down. And never drop the throat. And second thing is, try to remind the players that the feeling, when they're trying to learn the tongue, the feeling, all the sensation and the feeling should be in the front part of their mouth, not the back. So a lot of times when they're trying to tongue, often they would move the entire tongue. So that the feeling often will be focused very much on the back, right? And so just by reminding them to just focus on the tip of the tongue and very forward, that might prevent them to exaggerate their action. And to help that, I often will have to use syllables to help the players to really feel how they're moving the tongue. Now, before I get into it more, I just want to tell you upfront the syllables that are best used for teaching saxophone tonguing. Now, most of the complaint for saxophone tonguing is that it's either too heavy or too loud, or it's making strange noises. So that often is because the player is moving too much of their tongue. Okay, so and therefore the syllables that I choose are syllables that make the tongue move less. So for example, the syllable like t t t t t or d d d d d d d d d d d d. So it's moving very little, the tip part of the tongue, right? And another example would be like do 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 or tu 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 tu. You also really focus on the front part of the tongue. Now often people would teach with the syllable of like da 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 ta 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 ta. Well, that might work sometimes, but on a saxophone, if you change the syllable with a heavier sound, like a ah sound, the focus is further back to your throat. Okay, so that alone would create a lot more a louder sound when they tongue. So, for example, this is more TTT or DDD, more forward feeling syllables. So the difference with the da syllable would be like this. As you can hear, the sound is really quite different. So even for a beginner, I think you could help them by just reminding them to move less of the tongue and don't focus on the back. Especially for younger players, whenever they feel a little ticklish or feel uncomfortable, they immediately feel backward, they're feeling through the back of the throat. So it's a very natural reaction, but we have to kind of remind them to focus in the forward position. Now, for those of you who sometimes might have to teach students that might speak a different language, their mother tongue is not English, often the syllables might have a different set of syllables. So one thing to remember is you don't have to use the TTT or DDD or just use do do do. You can find syllables maybe in their own language that would give a slightly higher pitch and moving the tongue less syllable. But most languages have a similar sound syllable, so I don't think you would necessarily encounter that situation. But if you do, just make sure to find a syllable that would move the tongue less. That would be a good start for learning how to tongue. So it can be complicated and difficult for the student to feel in the beginning, but again, if you have to remember one thing, just don't move the back of the tongue. Keep the tongue stable and focus the feeling in the front part of the tongue, and then that would hopefully help them to start their learning of tonguing on the saxophone a little bit easier. When we're talking about posture while playing the saxophone, we can't really talk about it without mentioning the neck strap. It is really an essential item while holding the saxophone, even for the smaller member of the family, the soprano saxophone, for example. Now, the students can use the neck strap that comes with the instrument, which is a very basic design. You would find also commercially available neck straps that have extra padding, which would obviously make holding the saxophone on the neck a lot more comfortably. However, the function itself is basically the same. There's one type of neck strap that I would, however, recommend that you stay away from, and it is the kind that with elastic element. So while initially, when the student uses those elastic neck strap, it will feel pretty comfortable and almost weightless because it kind of dispense the weight quite well. However, the problem with those kind of elastic neck strap is that over time it will stretch gradually, often without the players knowing that it's being stretched. So what happens is that the student will gradually adjust their body to the angle and to the instrument. And as the instrument stretch more forward, then the student will try to lean forward toward the instrument. And as you can guess, eventually it would be quite uncomfortable, and the posture, eventually the student will conform to that kind of a bad angle. So I would suggest stay away from those elastic neck strap if possible. And now obviously there are, again, like the Mouthpiece and the reed, there are many brands and many designs out there, and often that is a very personal choice. So I would, if possible, recommend that the student go to a music shop and try on different neck straps with their instruments and see which one they like best. So when it comes to the posture, our general understanding or rules on good posture still apply. For example, standing or sitting straight, shoulders back but relax. But there are two areas that I would like to highlight for you. The first is angle of approach of the saxophone mouthpiece. What I mean by that is that as the student trying to play the instrument, they would bring it to the mouth. And this is kind of related to how the students adjust the neck strap. So if you see your student doing this, obviously the instrument is too low, so they are lowering their head as they are trying to play the horn, right? So they would need to adjust the strap. But as you can see now, it's too high. So, they might look up like this when they play. Obviously both angles are terrible for playing the instrument. The general rule is this: the instrument must adjust to the players, not the other way around. So if the neck strap is adjusted correctly, when the student brings the horn to their embouchure, it should just comfortably rest right there, right in there, without having the arm or the thumb pushing up the instrument, the weight of the instrument. All the weight should be distributed on the neck strap itself. The second thing is the position of the instrument. There's been a long time myth about playing the saxophone, and that is that people believe that when the student plays a horn, they should put it on the side of the body, and that's simply not true. Physiologically, the most comfortable meeting point for our two arms is in the center, and that's normally how we hug people, right? And so it's the most natural and comfortable way of meeting our two arms. And so when playing the saxophone is the same. So our two arms will kind of meet in the center and has the equal distance when we're pushing the keys. Now another thing you have to watch is you have to make sure that the arm and the wrist should be in a straight line as much as possible, depending on the length of the student's arm, obviously. But ideally, when they play the saxophone, they should be straight. And because of that, when they're standing, the saxophone might be pointing toward their left just a little bit because of the right arm, to make sure that they are not bent a certain way. So Even though the horn is remaining in the center of the body, but it's tilted slightly to the left so that their arm can be straight. Now, for alto and soprano, it's the same when they're sitting down. So even when they're sitting down, they have to keep the horn in the center. The exception comes when the student is playing tenor saxophone or baritone saxophone. Obviously, they're much larger instruments. My suggestion would be that they would sit toward the edge of the chair without falling over, obviously. Carefully sit closer to the edge of the chair and then put the tenor or the baritone on the side of their thigh and then play that way. The one thing that you have to observe is to make sure that they don't trying to lean their body to the left, because both tenor and baritone are quite heavy instruments, so sometimes they feel like they can kind of dispense the weight of the instrument this way, but obviously that would hurt their back and their arm muscles or their neck even, so that's definitely not a recommended practice. So make sure they are still sitting straight when they're playing the tenor and the baritone saxophone as much as possible. So again, the student must adjust and bring the instrument to them, not the other way around. I'm going to try to answer some questions regarding saxophone vibrato. The most common one would be, when should I introduce vibrato to the students? There's really no easy answer there because each student progresses differently. But usually after 6 months to a year of study, and as long as the student can sustain a tone with good sound and good air support, they can begin to explore on how to do saxophone vibrato. Although there are several methods that you often hear on how to apply the vibrato. Some people say that you can use air, some people say you can use throat, some people say you can use the jaw to do the vibrato. Now in the case of the saxophone, under normal circumstance, in the classical at least medium, I recommend using the jaw to apply the vibrato. And the action is really quite simple. You're basically using the jaw to push the reed up and then let it go. Push the reed up and then let it go. Now you will hear sometimes some conflicting information, such as people would recommend you pull down the jaw first and then go up. Now obviously that really I think is a misconception, because you can't, when you have an embouchure like this, you can't really go down without going up first, because if you just go down, you will be leaving the reed. So in other words, the sound, if you're doing it right, it will be like this. Like so. So the action again is really quite simple. And another question is, when do you use the vibrato? And again, when to apply the vibrato is often a kind of a musical decision, and it's a very personal choice. But normally my suggestion is that you use vibrato on a longer duration. Obviously you're not going to use vibrato on every single note, so often just as a tool of expression, you use it on a longer notes. How fast should you do the vibrato? Again, there's really no a rule here for everybody, because each person's expression is a little bit different. But as a starting point, I would recommend a quarter note equals around 80 to 82, and with 4 undulations. So it would be something like this. And another question is, how much of the vibrato? Should I do a little bit or a lot? And the basic rule is this, that when you're playing a soft dynamic, you normally don't use vibrato or use very little. By little, I mean the amplitude, very little. But when it's playing very intense dynamic, you can obviously increase the amplitude of the vibrato and make it more intense. Vibrato is really a wonderful embellishment to that tone. If it's applied correctly, and it is a wonderful musical expression that the student can enjoy. And when they enjoy their sound and the added expression, they will be more inclined to practice more. So it really helps their motivation that way. So finally, there are just a couple more topics that I would like to touch on. The first one is the altissimo range on the saxophone. So what is considered the altissimo range? As most of you know, the regular range on most of the saxophone, except baritone saxophone, is from the written low B flat 3 to the written F sharp 6. So anything beyond these notes are considered in the altissimo range. And you can go even higher than that. In fact, there are quite a few repertoire that require the player to go into the altissimo range. Now the question is, when do you introduce your students into this extended technique? Similar to vibrato, if the student is able to have a good control on their sound and the production of the sound, in this case they would also need to have a mastery on the full range of the instrument. Once they can achieve that, then they're ready for the challenge to learn how to go up to the altissimo range. Even though there are books out there that can give them some pointers on how to achieve it with fingerings and so on, but playing altissimo are not simply just pushing some keys. It requires the player to know how to manipulate their oral cavity and the embouchure to overblow basically the harmonics to go into the altissimo range. And remember the 4 areas that I mentioned earlier for the embouchure: lips, tongue muscle, throat opening, and the upper palates. So the student would need to learn how to manipulate these 4 areas along with the airstream to learn to play the altissimo range. And it can get pretty complicated and frustrating in the beginning. So a lot of patience is needed. And that's also why I think at this point, when they're ready to go into the extended technique, they would definitely need a teacher to help them along the way. So if they haven't been studying under a private instructor, this would be a good time to introduce them to somebody who can sit next to them and tell them what they're doing right or what they're doing wrong. It would really benefit them in the future, especially if they plan to further their study in college. Most of the programs I know are performing music that require players to be able to do the altissimo range. As a matter of fact, I think I would encourage students to start, let's say if they started learning the saxophone in grade 7 or 8, they should be able to start learning the altissimo range around grade 10 or grade 11. So lastly, I just want to talk briefly on saxophone repertoire. On my handout, I have put down a list of recommended repertoire and method books by different grade levels. I hope that you will share them with your students and encourage them to explore these pieces. I understand that many band directors, not just in Iowa but around the country really, they are comfortable with what they know for many years from solo and ensemble contests, and I understand that. However, many of those pieces were not originally written for the saxophone. They were arrangements from other instruments. Currently, we have a lot of wonderfully and idiomatically written works by well-known composers for the instruments. Besides, if your students decide to pursue music in the college level, they would need to be studying those original compositions. So it's important that they start early and learn some original compositions for the auditions. So thank you so much for giving me a hearing. This talk has been a little bit longer than I anticipated, but thank you for listening and for joining us today. I hope that you have a wonderful summer and stay safe. Thank you.